This is a podcast called Building the Open Web. Today we have Brett Gibson. Maybe you can start with a little bit of your background. How did you decide to go into entrepreneurship in the first place back in the day?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks a lot for having me. Excited to be here chatting with you. Yeah, so I was, I started out studying philosophy in college, and then I I came out of college right after the dot-com bubble and had a hard time getting a job, sort of with a philosophy degree. So I ended up teaching myself to program, and then just started reading essays by Paul Graham, and sort of naturally went into entrepreneurship. I think partially it started because I just didn't really want to have a boss. So I thought running my own company would be a better fit. And then so through that, I started a couple companies, and one of them got funded by Y Combinator as part of the 2008 batch for the last one in Boston. And then we were actually around during the last major crash. So we were all trying to fundraise in 2008 when all the markets were tanking. So a lot of the things we're kind of seeing these days have echoed from that experience. But that's also where I met Gary Tan, who founded the venture firm I work at. He and I became co-founders at a company called Posterous, which is a blog platform. So I worked with him there and wrote software and worked with the engineering team. And then I joined him at Y Combinator and wrote software there, all their kind of internal software systems, before joining Initialized in 2017 to both work on our internal software and then invest and help startups.
For Initialized, do you focus mainly on crypto or exclusively on crypto or different kinds of things?
Yeah, no, I focus on a few different things. I think the through line is kind of where it helps to have a background in writing software and being one of the more technical people on the team. And so, but I do, I lead sort of our crypto efforts. When I joined, I was one of the ones kind of willing. I had some background. I'd done some research into sort of decentralized systems in Web3 based on our work at Posthaven, because part of the deal with Posthaven is that we were promising to keep the blogs online forever. And so, we were doing research around like what can we use decentralized systems to like put more teeth to that promise beyond us just saying it. And then so yeah, so I was reading all the white papers and I don't know, crypto just kind of became my thing. I also look at things like um, cloud infrastructure, developer tooling, some of the AI and ML startups.
hmm That makes sense. And what do you think overall about the crypto ecosystem when you started reading about it for the first time versus where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, so like when I joined was 2017, so it was like a lot of reading white papers for ERC20 utility tokens that I largely didn't think had any play, made any sense. Like there was no real reason for additional tokens for all these things, and I think a lot of that's played out. I think that there's been a lot of maturing in where token systems work. I think people around the time, I think that, it was this new sort of exciting thing. We can design these new economic systems. And so people immediately kind of exploded the search space there to try and figure out where they might insert novel economics and, designing all sorts of game mechanics and the like to add tokens. And so that was kind of a crazy time. These days I do feel like, I feel like we're still unsure the extent to which we need to have all the systems we interact with be totally economic systems. I think I probably over time have moved toward believing more things will end up with tokens integrated in them than I did before. I think I was like maybe too skeptical at first, but at the same time, the world has moved towards sort of less token models.
hmm And what do you think also will be happening with like financial markets collapsing right now? Do you anticipate that amount of people entering the space will be dramatically decreased this year, next year?
It's a really interesting thing. I mean, I think obviously, there's a lot of talk and speculation that there would be some sort of flight to safety into these assets, and I was always a little skeptical of them because at least to some to some degree, you have to assume a lot of them are risk on and they're highly liquid. So, the immediate sell off when the public markets were doing terrible made a lot of sense. But then, it seems like things have kind of found a floor, at least for now, and maybe even recovering sort of in finding more liquidity and health than the other markets. So I think that I do. I think that especially in at a high level, I think that one of the things that's hard for people in the United States to understand is how much the rest of the world does, in fact, need more sound currencies, right? Like the dollar works pretty well for people who have ready access to it. So people are scared about kind of the money printing machine and what that means for the U.S. economy, and B, that this crisis is actually going to take material impact onto smaller economies and their monetary systems. I think that points pretty readily towards people moving into the crypto ecosystem because these assets, because of the guarantees that come from things like, and especially in the case of Bitcoin, where it's this sort of digital store of value.
And do you think of adoption path there is happening more like from fringes to the center, or do you think like some bigger players like Libra or somebody else would kind of get to some bigger adoption?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that so I think we've already seen in the store value use case, right? Like that things are moving from the fringes to the center, right? There's the early adopters of Bitcoin were all very ideologically bought in to the system, and they wanted it to have utility, but ideology was a sort of big part of the participating motivation. And now when you're seeing sort of major financial institutions start to look at these assets and think about wanting to hold them and or service them, that's obviously far less ideologically driven. So the other end of the spectrum in terms of like consumer adoption is probably some sort of like stable coin, right? And I think you're right to mention something like Libra, because in those cases, in a means of exchange, what's really important is distribution, because no one's no you can only exchange with people who also value and are set up to exchange in the currency. So I, I'm actually unsure. I think that if Libra, something like Libra gets off the ground, it will be really powerful just because of the number of people it can get to sort of overnight. But the trending I'm seeing and especially kind of stable ERC20 based stable coins and dollar backed ones, it seems to be pretty promising from a bottoms up perspective too.
Hmm. That makes sense. And also for Initialize specifically, what kinds of I guess first of all, like how do you evaluate teams when crypto teams coming through your door? What kinds of things are the most important to you?
What's interesting about us and sort of relative to other people maybe that are in the crypto ecosystem is that we're kind of constrained in just how our fund works, right? We're set up kind of specifically to be helpful to teams, and and we come, our founding partners come from Y Combinator. The goal was to do a lot of similar things at a slightly later stage. So we have 8 partners now. We all come from software startups, and we work pretty heavily with our portfolio. And because we have a larger seed fund, the latest one being $225 million, we also have like a relatively high ownership target. And so it's a lot for us to take on a new investment. And often, investing in crypto has been a little different from what we see in the rest of the portfolio, in that it seems like the major investors are the staging concepts aren't always as clear. Like seed, Series A, Series B, what level of de-risking a company's at and what it's raising. And then there's often, especially in token rounds, a lot more participants in the round. And so things like ownership stake aren't really as sensible. So first and foremost, I think we're looking for opportunities, still being believers in crypto and the ecosystem. We're looking for opportunities that fit our model and how we work with and fund companies. And then from there, yeah, I'd say we probably are we over-index on founders. I probably over-index on technical founders who, I generally tend to think that, technical people can learn the business side. It's harder for business people to go hire technical people because they don't really know how to evaluate them. And then, in crypto these days, there's kind of no shortage of really talented technical people as far as I can tell. So that's generally not the problem. The problem that sort of we see, and the what makes it hard for me to invest in some crypto companies is go to market mostly, because it's like getting these systems into people's hands and getting them using them and having sort of eventual users excited and real business models is harder right now. And I think the reason that is because we're largely still in a infrastructure phase. And so if you're building a user facing application on Ethereum, and Ethereum is in the middle of a huge migration, right? That introduces a lot of risk for you, for your customers. And so, nearer term, you can be right about what you're building, but the timing can still be off if the infrastructure is not already. So, we're interested in things that are either part of that infrastructure or are kind of servicing the infrastructure. So, or they have sort of near term use cases. So, examples would be like like obviously new layer ones are novel infrastructure and part of that system. We haven't invested in a lot of those simply because of the sort of ownership dynamics I was describing before. But and then there's just pure infrastructure plays, like something like Bison Trails, where they're just regardless of when the application, the end user application comes, there's still going to be need to be running all these nodes in the near term. And then something like Coin Tracker, right? Like it's kind of it's a bet directionally on the ecosystem. You need to believe that crypto assets are a large and growing asset class, but they're able to service people today that need to do their taxes.
Hmm. And also, maybe you can talk about differences between your investment interest and personal interests as well, and how they diverge.
Yeah, sure. I think what really excites me about crypto generally is both. I think that the more I learned about software security and the more I learned about how we secure these systems, the more kind of terrified I became. I think that at scale, like most computers around are not have not been owned or the like, because for lack of just effort, right? So I fear that we're kind of sitting on a widespread security problem in software generally. And I would so those things I'm really interested in are around security, and then especially like privacy, because in the implication security has on personal privacy. With all these software systems we're interacting with, we've seen over and over breaches and the like. And so what's excited me about crypto is the actual how far it's how much it's driven um, research and applications of novel cryptography, and what that might mean for like privacy preserving systems in the future. And it's interesting because it's like it's not always something. I don't think that set of technologies necessarily requires decentralization. There's kind of, it was kind of like the Hasib Qureshi from Dragonfly just had that podcast about kind of fetishizing decentralization for its own end, where it's really a means to end. And when you think about kind of really like it's not necessarily true that things need to be decentralized for users to preserve privacy. So like, and in a great example, something like Signal, right? Like it's a centralized service, and there's two things going on there. One is that individuals aren't really good at keeping software systems up to date and being hygienic in their OPSEC practices. And so you kind of have to give it to them in a very easy to use way, and then like upgrade things for them. And in theory, if you can get the cryptography good enough, you can build it in such a way that I think Signal has shown. Well, if you believe the guarantees that they're claiming about how their system works, they're showing that they can provide people privacy while still actually running and controlling the servers. So I think stuff like that's really interesting. I think that it takes talented sort of product teams to deliver the type of experience that is palatable to individuals under which they'd be willing to keep their system secure, because there's always this like convenience to security trade-off. And I think if we really want privacy and security, we need someone who's kind of create like easy to use software.
Hmm. And how do you also think overall about monetization in space? Maybe we can talk a little bit about value capture overall in the blockchain. Coming back to the blockchain, what have you seen as monetization opportunities?
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. Like, obviously, everything that is competing to be money is going to monetize well. I mean, setting aside sort of, the legal ramifications of investors investing in things that are going to be money, and what's going on with safes and sort of these ICOs. But I think a lot of things kind of, it's hard when you look at these totally decentralized systems, and how value is going to accrue, because if there's some cases in which they do actually need some sort of internal token, and it's useful, but there's a lot of cases where it's not, and I'm not really sure. And there are arguments to be made that, like, something like Compound, right, can introduce a token, and it will be used because Compound has already built the community, right, and sort of it's, even if you don't have very strict technical requirements, like having building community like is a pretty powerful thing. But that always leaves things at risk of forking. And when you think of smart contract based systems, they're forkable not really in the like Bitcoin sense, but in like the Git sense, right? Like, these are literally open source systems. Someone can go find your code and remove the token and deploy it fairly rapidly. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's hard to reason today around where the value is going to be captured and how many things are going to be paid for, or have some sort of token that works long term. I'm glad that a lot of experiments are being run, but it sometimes it worries me to sort of take bets on. I think at a high level, we're kind of, as a sector, we're just branching out into a lot of different ideas at once, and most of the kind of evolutionary branches are going to die, but that doesn't make it interesting and useful to be in this like sort of like wide fan out phase.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's probably like too early to even say what's going to work out on monetization front. It's kind of like far out from building out infrastructure, getting users.
And even something like Signal, again, like, it's super super useful tool. A lot of people depend on it, and since it's been around, the funding of Signal and the Signal Foundation has been kind of an open question, right? It's unclear that the best, most useful thing will be able to monetize at scale.
Hmm. And overall, like, do you think we're like in very early stages of the build out, or like how would you quantify it somehow?
I think we are still pretty early for most sort of end user facing things, but it does feel like things are moving faster. So comparisons are a little weird. The ramp up on kind of tooling, developer tooling, and many of these ecosystems has been really impressive. I mean, from the first time I tried to like write some like Ethereum based smart contracts, and what it looks like today, and what these other platforms like Near are kind of focusing on, has been impressive. So I think the end state is when these decentralized systems are sort of transparently used by end users, where they don't really have to know. And I think at first there was there was a little while where people kind of ignored that fact and assumed that people would be willing to incur all the extra complexity, I guess, for ideological reasons. But it seems like teams developing today have internalized that fact, and I think that sort of transition is important in accelerating actually usable systems.
Hmm. And it seems like you're referring to both developer tooling and also usability for like consumers.
Yeah, I mean, developer tooling, developers are going to deal with some complexity. That's fine. But for consumers, like, you I think everyone who's kind of deep in it, for like an example would be like gas or an Ethereum, right? If you're deep in the system, you understand why it's there and why it needs to be there, and it makes sense, and you can reason about it. But no one, no one who's just, if people just want stablecoins to send to friends and local merchants, they don't want to be reasoning about something like that. And so we need abstractions that make that possible. And I feel like, there's been a lot of movement in that direction.
Hmm. I see. And overall, also in entrepreneurs that you've seen so far, like what are the kind of differences between what you've seen like back in YC days when those traditional internet startups versus here? Like what are the skill sets that are transferable and kind of like the same exact thing goes, like go to markets or validating things before building, and what is different and what's required in terms of skill set and team?
I think for the most part, I believe it's pretty similar, right? Like the North Star is still the same North Star. Like you gotta figure out what people actually want and what they're willing to pay for, and get it in front of them, and do customer development and iterate. And the I think what's different about um, the crypto ecosystem is that because a lot of these things are meant to be decentralized, eventually it's easy to convince yourself that you need to sort of design them from first principles and have them totally ready at launch. And like, not I that sounds kind of like disparaging, but it's true. Like if you do in fact want to release something that's going to be like a novel proof of work network or something, like you need everything working when it launches, or else someone's just going to own it and it's not going to go anywhere. So that and that kind of sort of development is pretty different from, and that kind of thinking is pretty different from kind of the move fast and iterate startup mentality that both existed then and today. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I know. I think that's sort of like falls to a different category of entrepreneur, but it is an interesting problem, and I think that is why the other approach obviously is to build the kind of incremental decentralization, right? Build something that's largely centralized, and add decentralization over time, and or hooks towards decentralization, right? So like Coinbase is a centralized service. It interacts with the decentralized world, right? Like at any time you can remove your Bitcoin from Coinbase and self custody. So if you start with a sort of centralized service that's adjacent and do it in that direction, you don't really have to do as much kind of first principles planning.
Well, cool. Sounds good. Thanks a lot for coming today.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's super fun.
Thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of this podcast at openwebcollective.com. If you're a founder looking for help with product, go-to-market, or fundraise, apply on the same exact website. It's openwebcollective.com. If you really like this episode, I would really appreciate if you give us a review on a platform of choice where you listen to podcasts to. And finally, if you're on Twitter, we are at OpenWebFounders. Again, the handle is at OpenWebFounders. I'll see you next week.